Science doesn't tell us how to live. That belongs to the general public. But once you decide on the kind of world you want to have and the kind of world ocean we want, then we would be well to heed the advice that the late Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said: you don't improve the quality of a technical decision by asking a lot of uninformed people.
Well, welcome everybody to the Sea Has Many Voices, continuing the really great conversation with Dr. Jerry Schubel, the president and CEO of the Aquarium of the Pacific. And you want to talk about fossil fuels again. What are you thinking?
Well, they've caused a very serious situation. We now know that. I think we make a mistake, though, of demonizing fossil fuels. They are responsible for much of the quality of life that we all enjoy, that our warm and cool buildings that we live in, our electricity, our transportation. We now know, though, that we've got to stop using those fossil fuels. And I think that we know the direction that we need to go in, and you don't have to just be beating up all the time on big oil or big coal.
Yeah. I'm in agreement with you there that we want to move away from polarizing discussions and approaches, because you don't make a lot of progress in my experience. No. You need to get shoulder to shoulder with the oil companies and work out solutions together. And I believe there's willingness there. There's certainly international agreement in the world through the United Nations climate work. However, there are some outliers, and there's still some coalition building to be done. But the science is clear of what we need to do, and the question now is, triggering that motivation to do it. And that's the good news: is we have the science, we understand.
That's right.
That's the good news. We, in our careers, Jerry, and you and I have, learned together. The way I've seen the arc of marine conservation, which by extension is Earth conservation. So when you talk about ocean, it's really about the Earth. Is at the beginning, we were so busy trying to figure out what was going on. We were just like, something's happening, but we didn't know what it was. And then we identified the problems. And remember that famous book? I think you gave it to me. It was a book called Marine Biological Diversity it was by AAAS in the 90s. And they had a scientific panel identify 5 major threats to the ocean. And it was, if I remember them all, climate change was there, biodiversity extinction was there, habitat destruction was there, eutrophication was there, and there was one or other. But it was an important moment, because we finally zeroed in on what we were doing that was wrong. And then we didn't have solutions, right? And that was where you and I pioneered some together, and with many other scientists. It took us about another 10 years, I reckon, to get the solution set, the toolbox. And that's where we are now, right?
We have the toolbox. We're still not using those tools.
We're not using them yet.
And I think having the science and not using it doesn't. That's not the answer. And I'm reminded of 2 quotes. One from Leo Tolstoy, who said, "Science doesn't tell us how to live. It has nothing to contribute on moral grounds." And he was right. Science doesn't tell us how to live. That belongs to the general public. But once you decide on the kind of world you want to have and the kind of world ocean we want, then we would be well to heed the advice that the late Nobel laureate Richard Feynman said when he made the comment: you don't improve the quality of a technical decision by asking a lot of uninformed people. And we tend to ask a lot of uninformed, well-intentioned people, and that puts us on, I think, on the wrong path. So we have to respect science more and use it more.
Wow, that's very powerful. Yeah, I agree with you there, and you're helping me now. You're kind of giving me some new ways of looking at this. Yeah. What was that about again? Science is not a moral.
Tolstoy
unpack
said,
that a little
"Science
bit.
doesn't tell us how to live. It has nothing to contribute on moral grounds."
Okay.
We both know science can be used for good or ill.
Right.
But the public decides the kind of world we want to live in.
That's right.
But we confuse goals with how to get there.
Yes.
And so we've got to have greater faith in our scientists and the technology that we have in moving us in the direction we need to go.
Well, I think you've summarized well that we are at a point in history in the arc of civilization. This is really important, Jerry. I mean, we are at a point where we know what we're doing. We didn't know
Right.
even 20 years ago what we were doing,
Right.
but we know what we're doing now, and we also know how to fix it.
Yes.
And to me, it's a, I don't know what, it's a travesty that we're not deliberately moving quicker than we are.
I agree.
There's no excuse.
There's no excuse. It's an ethical, moral issue, and we need to get on with it. We need to do things.
I mean, I always like to think, why don't we? I mean, I think political election cycles are one of them. Politicians that have the authority to make some of these changes, they only look to the next election cycle usually, not all of them. What if we had a 100-year election cycle? You know, they would make different decisions, right? if you were reelected on what happened 100 years from now.
Or if you were even held responsible for the decisions you made during your time in office, so that even though you leave office, somehow you're accountable.
What do you think? What are some of the most consequential, positive political decisions that been made in terms of the environment over the last 100 years?
Well, I think a lot of them were back in the 1970s. 1972 was a watershed year when that great environmental president, Richard Nixon.
It's ironic, isn't it?
The Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species
Why
Act.
did that happen then with him? How did that happen? You're right. There was so much public policy developed in the United States, and then it tended to be copied by other countries. Almost verbatim in some cases.
And now we're weakening.
And we look back now, and he's considered one of our worst presidents for other reasons. But he gave us you're right. That was why was that with him? Do you know?
I don't know. It was a confluence of things. I think it was Rachel Carson and a lot of things all
just happened to
came together. And there wasn't any great cost of doing it either. So there wasn't a great political cost of doing it. So and he had been backed into the corner.
So you're telling me now we need another year like Richard Nixon in 1972 to save the world environmentally?
No, but we need something different than we have right now.
Well, I think you're right there. Other things that come to mind for me, and when you described the amorphous nature of the problem, I thought back for moments and thinking about, well, we have solved a few, but they were very specific, like the ozone.
Right.
Is a great example.
Yes.
Right. That was a moment where. Can you tell that story, please?
Well, you go ahead.
There was a moment where we knew that releasing certain chemicals that were used as accelerants in aerosols went up into the higher atmosphere and degraded the ozone layer, which allowed more ultraviolet radiation into the Earth. And in places like Antarctica and New Zealand and Australia, and I lived in New Zealand for a while, it was particularly bad. Yeah. And there were special measures taken where you couldn't be outside without a hat and all covered up in the middle of summer because there was this ultraviolet radiation coming in that was burning your skin and causing higher rates of skin cancer. Well, we looked at the science in the world and found out what the problem was, and we stopped using those chemicals. There's a thing called the Montreal Protocol.
Yep.
And within 10 or 20 years?
Yeah.
We saw the effect.
Right. That was one where the solution, once it was implemented, the repair took place quite rapidly. That's not going to be the case for climate change.
Are you aware of any wild solutions that people have for rapid climate change fixes? Global engineering.
I think, first of all, on the emission side.
Yeah.
I think nuclear has to play a bigger role. It's the highest energy density. It's the largest source of clean energy we have, and I would argue that it's the safest source of clean energy we have. If you look at the record of nuclear, and forget about Jane Fonda and the recent Chernobyl series, it has a remarkable safety record that has gotten very distorted. I think part of this issue also, though, is dealing with these big problems. These are called wicked problems, as you know. There are no solutions to them, no silver bullets. If you formulate them properly, you can manage them and keep them within bounds. And climate change is certainly one of those. we're not trained. Our universities aren't structured to deal with these kinds of problems very well. A guy named Bernard Forscher wrote a very powerful article a number of decades ago that academia is in the business of making bricks, discrete packets of knowledge. You get promoted, you get tenured by the more bricks that you make. You don't get promoted and tenured by assembling bricks into configurations that help us deal with these big transdisciplinary issues. And we need organizations that are dedicated to taking the knowledge that we have, assembling it, formulating it in ways to address some of these big issues.
Wow. Yeah, you really hit the nail on the head there again. That is, I'm in so much agreement with you that we need, the way I frame it, but it's the same thing as lateral thinking. We need lateral thinking. We've been siloed in our thinking. We tend to look at one area problem and try to fix it without realizing that there's a series over here. And it's hard to become an expert in everything that needs to be done. No one can do that.
No one can.
So it's a question of coordinating that knowledge and then making the action. This nuclear, I have to ask you though, because the listeners are going to wonder, and I also wonder, what about the waste?
Well,
what's the solution path? Because it's
okay. The waste is still an issue, but if you look at the fourth generation of nuclear, the amount of waste is far smaller than in previous, because they're using spent fuel rods also as fuel.
Okay.
And again, it's relative risk. If you think about all of the solar panels that are just loaded with noxious materials, hazardous materials. They have a lifetime of 20 to 25 years. We have no idea how we're going to dispose of those.
I didn't know that.
And also...
What kind of material in the solar panel? Do you know?
Lots of hazardous materials, and also in the construction of windmills. And these are masses that are orders of magnitude larger than anything from nuclear. Now, nuclear, we still need a federal repository, and I hope there'll be some leadership eventually on that.
A place to put it.
Place to put it.
Yeah.
Place to put it.
I saw in a documentary recently that we're talking about this issue, and you have to think very long term though about this place, because it's in some cases it's going to be hundreds to thousands of years, right?
Yes.
That it has to be contained and aware of, and there are people already thinking about, okay, if we bury it in this mountain, how do we put information outside this mountain that can be understood by another language, another civilization, another culture that could be here 10,000 years from now, to know that it's dangerous? And it was a very interesting show, because they were assuming there would be a collapse in a civilization and in a nation, which, as it always has happened, languages go away and new ways of thinking, and you forget stuff. So then you discover this, and they were working on symbology that they thought would transcend any. Do you know about this kind of work?
No.
Yeah.
No.
But those are the kind of things we have to think about when we think about nuclear waste, right? Is long-term storage of the.
You have to think about that, but you shouldn't be immobilized by that kind of thinking.
Yeah.
Because if we don't get on a different track, we're not going to live that long.
That's right. Unfortunately, it's the.
And you and I go back far enough. Remember the days when there were proposals to bury high level nuclear waste on the seafloor.
Certainly do.
Near the trenches. Because they would be then carried down into the central part of the earth. They wouldn't emerge for several 100,000 years.
If ever.
If ever. If ever.
Right.
And but those ideas were killed. I think the one thing we have to understand is we've got to be very bold in our thinking.
Yes.
And unfortunately, if the severity of this problem is anywhere near what we believe it is, and I do believe it's very severe, we've got to try things. We've got to be bold. And unfortunately, most of the environmental movement is to be cautious.
Yeah, that's right. And once burned, twice cautious, right? I mean, the history with the environmental community is that they feel like they've been misled by businesses over the last industrializations, and in some cases they have. But today we need to be bold. I agree with you. And that trench solution, I know the weakness in it, as I recall, was that it's not necessarily a steady one-way trip on as the seafloor crust for our listeners moves in the grand scheme of plate tectonics. Seafloor crust goes down into a trench, back into the mantle, and somewhere else new mantle material comes up, creating new seafloor crust. And this is what keeps the Earth dynamic in terms of the continental positions. So why not stick this stuff into one of these trenches down into the mantle, where by the time it comes back, and it may never come back by the nature of how things work. And the problem I heard was that some scientists said that sometimes there's a slippage back and forth, that you might put it down and it'll go down and then it'll come back, or that it could go down and come out of a volcano sooner than you expected. But it seems to me you could work, I think there must be workarounds for those.
I think yes, I think there have to be.
You'd have to look at it. You'd have to look at it, yeah. Okay, well that's a sobering realization for me, the nuclear, because I grew up in an age where people ran from it, and then, as you said, there's been this media around it, but I have tremendous trust in your judgment. So you're seeing nuclear as a piece of our future, or the whole future?
Not the whole future, no. I think it has to be, there is no one way to
Right.
deal with this. And renewables are an important part of it, but they're not the
Right.
whole thing.
Right.
I think renewables in combination with nuclear are the best hope that we have.
Well, I saw that, I agree with you. I saw there was a pie chart somebody made once where they said, listen, this is the future is something like this. And the pie had different solutions, and nuclear was there, solar was there, wind was there, ocean currents were there. But what was not there is the release is fossil fuels.
Right.
So that's kind of it's like a game, right? You have these pieces over here and you need to make a pie. How's it going to work?
And yet the pie chart today, the percentage of that is accounted for by fossil fuels is still over 80% globally. So we've got a long ways to go.
Yeah, 80%. Well, that's a very, very helpful expansion on these ideas, Jerry. And I think there are very few people in the world that could do what you just did for me. So thank you for unpacking that. And I want to come back to a few other things in our next segment. But I think I was going to say put a ribbon around that, but it sounds too cheery. I think we've unpacked that for the moment enough. So thank you for that, and look forward to our next one.
All right. Thank you.